This is going to be the lecture over section 8.2, which is going to deal with solar energy capture. So a lot of this is going to be familiar when we talk about energy and wavelengths and the visible light spectrum, because we've covered it in chemistry before as well. So here we just have a familiar picture showing the wavelengths of the visible light spectrum, going from the shorter wavelengths with the indigo violet down here up to the longer ones with the red colors through here. And here we have Roy G. Biv as we go this direction. So solar energy can be described in terms of its wavelength and its energy content. White or visible light is only a small portion of the spectrum, and you can see that this very small portion right here. We have all these other different wavelengths of energy that we are being exposed to as well. Visible light contains various wavelengths. Violet light is the shortest wavelength, and it has the highest energy. And then red light is the longest wavelength and the lowest energy. And that should make sense in your head. We talked about that again in chemistry, so that helps to solidify that thought. There's only about 42% of the solar radiation that actually hits our atmosphere that reaches the surface. And most of it that reaches the surface is in the visible light range. This graph gives us a better view of what's actually being absorbed and reflected in chlorophyll A, B, and the carotenoids. And if you notice that chlorophyll A tends to absorb the most in the violet, indigo violet wavelengths, and reflects in this area here, which you see the green, that we see the plants looking, the leaves looking as green, so that's what's being reflected, not absorbed. And the absorption increases again down here in the 600 to 750 nanometer wavelength area. Chlorophyll B, again, has a high absorption in the blues, and it tends to reflect more in the green, yellow and green area, and absorb again in this end of the spectrum. Carotenoids are the same way. They tend to really absorb only the blues and the violets, and they absorb very little, if any at all, down here in the other colors. And if you start to think about the way that we look at leaves in the fall, we see mostly during the summertime, when there's a lot of solar energy to be captured, we see absorption of lots of different wavelengths, but reflection mainly in this area right here, which is green. So that's why our plants that are photosynthesizing appear green. However, in the fall, when we start to see a drop off in the amount of chlorophyll A and B that are being generated, we no longer see green reflected as much as we do the oranges and reds and yellows, because it's the carotenoids that we're starting to see, and they absorb in this wavelength and will reflect these colors instead of just reflecting in the green area. This just reinforces what we just discussed on the last slide. Green light is reflected and only minimally absorbed, and that's why our leaves appear green. Other plant pigments become noticeable in the fall when the chlorophyll starts to break down and other pigments are then uncovered. We're going to talk about the light reactions today. These take place in the thylakoid membranes, and the thylakoids are located inside of the chloroplast. So when you're asked where photosynthesis occurs, your answer should always be in the thylakoid membrane. The light reactions have two pathways. One's non-cyclic electron, and the other one is cyclic electron pathway. And we'll get into those in a little bit more detail in just a minute. Both of those are going to take solar energy and change it into chemical energy. Both pathways produce ATP. There's only one difference. The non-cyclic pathway also is going to produce NADPH, but not the cyclic pathway. So let's take a closer look at the non-cyclic pathway. Electron flow can be traced from a water molecule to a molecule of NAD+, and this non-cyclic electron pathway uses two photosystems. A photosystem is a pigment complex and an electron acceptor molecule that's within the thylakoid membrane. We can talk about this pigment complex as being like an antenna for gathering solar energy. The non-cyclic electron pathway is going to start with photosystem 2. We're going to talk about photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. They're not in order. It starts photosystem 2, then photosystem 1. They're not named for the order they happen in. They actually are named for the order that they were discovered in. So photosystem 2 was discovered second, but it's what happens first in the non-cyclic electron pathway. Pigment complex will absorb solar energy, the pigment complex we just spoke about. It passes from one pigment to another until it's concentrated in a reaction center. That reaction center is within a chlorophyll A molecule. The electrons in the reaction center, chlorophyll, become so energized that they escape from the reaction center and they move to an electron acceptor that's nearby. Photosystem 2 would disintegrate without replacement electrons. That's why it's called non-cyclic. It has to have more put into it. It doesn't cycle. These are provided by splitting water, which releases oxygen to the atmosphere. There's one of our sources of oxygen from photosynthesis. Hydrogen ions stay in the thylakoid space, and they can start to form a concentration gradient or contribute to the concentration gradient that's there. Photosystem 2, the electron acceptor that receives the energized electrons from the reaction center sends those electrons down an electron transport chain. We talked about an electron transport chain being very productive in cellular respiration. So you know that an electron transport chain is a series of carriers that passes electrons from one to the other. The energy that is released to pump those hydrogen ions into the thylakoid space form the hydrogen ion gradient. And when the hydrogen ions flow through ATP synthase, it turns ADP and phosphate into ATP. The next thing in the non-cyclic electron pathway is photosystem 1. And when the photosystem 1 pigment complex absorbs the energy from the sun, the electrons get energized and they leave the reaction center and they get captured by a different electron acceptor. The lower energy electrons from photosystem 2 are used to replace those that are lost by photosystem 1. The electron acceptor in photosystem 1 passes its electrons to NADP+, and that causes it to become NADPH. And here's just diagrams from your book that show this visually. Let's take a look at the cyclic electron pathway. This pathway only uses photosystem 1. So it starts off by the photosystem 1 complex absorbing solar energy, and then the electrons that are energized escape from the reaction center and they go down the electron transport chain. This releases energy and is stored in the form of hydrogen ion gradient, and that causes ATP production by the enzyme ATP synthase. The spent electrons return to the PS1 photosystem 1 complex, and that in turn makes it a cyclic pathway. The pathway only results in ATP production. No NAD plus or NADPH is produced. ATP from the cyclic and non-cyclic electron transport, the NADPH from the cyclic electron transport, these are ready to be used now in the Calvin cycle to make carbohydrates, which is the second portion of photosynthesis, and that's what we'll discuss in the next lecture. Let's finish up this section by looking at the organization of the thylakoid membrane. In the photosystem 2, it's made up of pigment complex and electron acceptors. The water is split to replace energized electrons, and we release oxygen. In the electron transport chain, it carries electrons from the photosystem 2 to photosystem 1. It uses the energy to pump hydrogen ions from the stroma into the thylakoid space. In photosystem 1, it's made up of pigment complexes and electron acceptors, and it's adjacent to the enzyme that reduces the NADP plus to the NADPH. The ATP synthase complex has a channel for hydrogen ions to flow, and the flow is what drives the synthase, which is the ATP synthase is the enzyme that does this to join ADP and the phosphate, making ATP. That in this diagram from your textbook as well. We'll finish up this lecture with ATP production. The thylakoid space acts as a reservoir for the hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ions are from the water being split, where they come from. They are pumped in by the electron transport chain. More hydrogen ions in the thylakoid space than the stroma causes electrochemical gradient because the hydrogen ion is charged. That's why we refer to that as the electrochemical gradient. The hydrogen ion can only flow through ATP synthase from the thylakoid space to the stroma across the thylakoid membrane to make ATP. And that's where the energy comes from, this flow that provides the energy to allow the ATP to be made by the process of chemiosmosis. So that concludes the light reactions of photosynthesis. Again, I want to suggest to you that you read your textbook, that you take time to fill in your notes using these notes and to refer back to your diagrams. We're going to do some activities in class that are going to help clear up things that may be a little bit confusing about this section. So after the internet activity, I think you'll have a better handle on what happens during the light reactions.